Chapter 12 Calamitous Dragon, Part 1.
So, how is the Twilight and Solaire happen to find you?
Applejack panted as she raced down the flights of stairs. The Griffin made use of her wings, jumping down entire flights, one leap at a time. She only paused when the mayor asked her question.
Good question, she replied. I guess it's more I found them. Me and some friends brought him over to our base. Helped them find out where Eve was, and they're helping us get to her.
She took another leap down as Applejack caught up to her.
Guess this means we're going to be working together for a while. Name's Gilda.
A pleasure.
They paused at the base of the stairwell, although it was not Gilda's idea. The Griffin studied the mayor as her claw rested on the door to the first floor. Applejack was moving a little slowly, but not due to a lack of urgency.
Okay, I'm not going to pretend I know all that about you ponies,
Gilda started.
But is the dress really necessary? We're in a bit of a rush here.
Applejack hesitated on the last step. A heavy blush burned beneath her still tear-stained face.
Of course,
she exclaimed, trying desperately to think of a better reason than the truth.
You see, it's just important.
She recomposed herself and trotted to the door, pushing it open past the Griffin.
I've worn dresses ever since I was a young filly. I assure you I can do just as much in them as any other pony could without.
Gilda huffed and rolled her eyes as she followed after her.
Why are ponies so obsessed with making themselves look pretty?
She grumbled to herself. The cold Manehattan streets welcomed them as they pushed through the doors. Far in the distance was a faint, steady rumble. Applejack and Gilda could feel the cobblestone shaking beneath them, as though there was a small earthquake. They shared an uncomfortable look.
Look, I'll take your word for it,
Gilda said.
But right now, we gotta go. Hope you don't mind your dress getting dirty, because we're gonna be taking a dip into the sewers. Come on.
The sewers?
Applejack covered her mouth with a hoof to hide some of her disgust.
What in heaven's for?
Well, I don't plan on being on the streets while a dragon is rampaging about,
Gilda snapped. She walked into the middle of the street and started lifting the grate.
Wait, but what about...
Applejack's voice trailed as she looked towards the alleyway. Even from here, she could still see the corner of their trailer.
What about their belongings? They should have left most of them in my trailer.
A sharp screech of metal against stone pierced the air, followed quickly by a harsh metal crash. Applejack winced and turned back to Gilda, who stared back at her with a deadpan expression.
You're joking,
the Griffin said, hoping that by saying it, it would become true. Applejack's hesitation was all the answer she needed. With a grunt, she abandoned the sewer entrance and marched back to the mayor.
What kind of belongings are we talking about? She pressed. How many?
Applejack made an uncertain face and cantered to the alley to find the answer to Gilda's questions. As she opened the door to her trailer and peeked inside, she felt her heart drop.
Solaire's sword and shield, I'm afraid, along with his helmet and tunic,
she called, trotting back to Gilda.
It looks like Twilight left most of her books as well. I don't think they were planning on leaving so early.
Gilda massaged her temples with her talons. Oh, she should have figured there would be a hitch.
All right, no big deal. I still don't feel comfortable taking the whole trailer through Manehattan, though. I'll grab the sword and shield. How much of the rest do you think you can carry?
Applejack didn't respond right away. And when Gilda looked up, she found the mayor staring wide-eyed at something past her. Before she even had a chance to ask, she heard her answer. A flurry of wings and a staccato of heavy metallic clinks against the cobblestone just behind her.
Well,
a rugged, feminine voice announced.
This goose chase wrapped itself up much faster than I thought it would.
With a swift beat of her wings, Gilda leapt into the air and spun around, landing next to Applejack. 5 Thestrals stood before them, right next to the open hole to the sewers. They were all part of the guard, of that there was no question, but she was unfamiliar with the armor. It was black as pitch. A crescent moon with a unicorn's profile was etched into the middle of a design on their cuirasses. Of the 5 of them, only 4 wore their helmets, which seemed to consume their heads and obscure their faces in shadows. Jagged horns like devils sprang out where their ears should have been. At the front of the formation stood the only Thestral without one, and her cold reptilian eyes pierced through the Griffin as she flashed a cocky, fanged grin.
I thought the Manehattan Guard sent one of their own after you,
the lead Thestral continued.
Wonder where he could be.
If you're so worried, I can show you what happened to him myself,
Gilda growled. It was 5 on 2, but Gilda might as well have been alone. Applejack did not strike her as the fighting type, not like Eve. She didn't like the odds. Right now, she was all bark and no bite, and the Thestral's bared fangs had never looked sharper.
Figures,
the late Thestral scoffed.
Never should have sent a city guard to do a knight's job. Tell you what, though. I was really betting on this taking a lot longer, at least until the real action started. What if I give you 2 a 5-second head start?
Gilda's teeth grinded together. This Thestral had a lot of nerve, and she wanted nothing more than to beat it out of her. For now, though, all she could settle for was glaring.
1.
With an aggravated growl, Gilda wrapped a claw around Applejack's barrel, and before the mare had a chance to protest, she launched them both into the air and soared down the street.
My heavens! Just where are we going?
Applejack demanded as she came out of shock.
Away!
Gilda snapped, stealing a glance back. The Thestrals were quickly shrinking in the distance, but as a second passed, she saw their wings unfurl, and they began their chase.
I don't feel like fighting 5 of them at once. You're all I came for, so I'm cutting my losses and getting it to Solaire and the others.
But what about his equipment?
Gilda rolled her eyes. It was difficult enough supporting the mare's weight while flying away from the Thestrals. She didn't appreciate having to argue her reasons on top of it.
It's tough luck. We're not going to be able to grab anything with those knights on our tails. All we can do is meet back with the group and hope we can take them all on together.
Applejack's mind was running as fast as the wind that whipped against her mane. There had to be some way to lose their pursuers. Twilight and Solaire were dependent on it. An idea sparked in the back of her head. It would be difficult to pull off, but it was their best bet. They were going north on Main Street, already heading in the right direction.
Do you know where the business district is?
She called over the wind.
What?
The business district,
Applejack repeated.
I think I know a way to stop the Thestrals.
We don't have time for I think,
Gilda snapped.
Gilda!
The Griffin looked down at her passenger, and Applejack locked eyes with her.
Trust me.
She wasn't sure what it was about this mare. Gilda had only just met her, but the look in her eyes told her everything she needed to know. Applejack had a plan. There was no I think about it. Gilda conceded with a sigh.
You had better be right about this.
Before the Thestral's eyes, the two banked sharply to the right. Lieutenant Shining Armor felt the eyes of 100 ponies watching him from the relative safety of their homes as he marched down the residential district with the dragon. He had refused to don his helmet before departing the Sky Bastion. He wanted all to see him, to recognize him. 5 years ago, he had been the symbol of hope, and his actions inspired others to follow the path he abandoned long ago. Now, all of Equestria needed to see what was waiting at the end of that road. All of Equestria needed to know the truth. No opponent could stand against Nightmare Moon. Not for long. Metal shrieked off to his right, followed by a sharp pop. The dragon was inspecting something in its massive claws, and its low growl shook the air. It wasn't until Shining Armor saw the stump of a metal lamppost at its feet that he realized what it was. He bit back the urge to groan, letting it instead escape as a harsh snort through his nostrils. Captain Nightingale had personally briefed him about the dragon. It was intelligent, if only barely. Armor found that it had the mental capacity of a young, spoiled foal, always grabbing at anything that shined to do whatever dragons did with them. Even now he witnessed it reach for another light, wrapping its powerful claws around it and squeezing until it popped. The beast let out a dissatisfied grunt as it found only shards of glass in its palm. And Shining Armor released a heavy sigh. He half thought Her Majesty sent it with him to make an already difficult task impossible. It understood most words, though, even if it couldn't speak for itself, and it was all Armor could do to convince the dragon to keep the property damage to a minimum. Hey! Cut that out! He barked. The dragon craned its neck down to look at him, and snarled with teeth as big as its head. Its hawk-like helm did little to hide the truth of the beast beneath. The etchings in the black plate seemed to only accentuate the features it hid. He held his ground, even though every instinct inside of him screamed to run away from the sight. "We have a mission," he continued sternly. "Once we capture the traitors, the princess will give you whatever shiny things you want. But until then, you can't keep breaking everything." Twin jets of black smoke shot from its nostrils and engulfed Shining Armor. He held his breath and stood his ground, trying his best not to cough. The dragon gave him a scrutinizing glare as the smoke cleared, and after a moment passed, it resigned to drop back onto all fours with a disappointed grunt. The earth shook from the impact. The apartment seemed to rock on their foundations, but the dragon paid them no mind as it continued to traipse down the street. With the dragon's back facing him, Armor allowed himself to sigh. He was used to ordering knights, not babysitting titans that could level a city in a tantrum. He shook his head and followed after the beast, knowing full well that it didn't know where to go on its own, and the last thing any pony needed tonight was a full-grown dragon wandering unsupervised through all of Manehattan. As they continued their journey through the maze-like cityscape, the lieutenant tried to keep his mind on the task at hand. It was only a matter of time until they closed in on the abandoned district of the city. He glanced up and saw the sky bastion looming over the skyline. In the relative silence of the streets, broken only by the monster's footsteps next to him, Shining Armor couldn't help but wonder. How many times had he been here? He was almost an expert at this point. Captain Nightingale had said it himself, and Armor hated the fact that he was right. The amount of rebellions he had stamped out since the end of the Civil War might have outnumbered the stars in the sky. Remnants of the old guard who disobeyed his surrender. Cultists from Canterlot who thought they knew a way to break Nightmare's curse and raise the sun themselves. He was unfortunate enough to have known many of their faces before he became a lieutenant in Her Majesty's Lunar Guard. Arresting friends and familiar faces was never easy. And it was even worse when it was family. His composure broke with a shudder as he walked, and he tried to blink away the memories of that night once more, the darkest night in his life. He wished he could pull back the clock, convince his father to stay away from those other crazy librarians and their ideas of creating a solar archive. Sooner or later it was bound to fail, but all the time in the world wouldn't have prepared Armor for when the princess herself ordered him to arrest his own family. He was just thankful that his little sister couldn't be found at the time. Though he couldn't help but wonder what had ever happened to her. He always thought it best not to try and find her, especially after what happened. He kept telling himself it was for the best. If Nightmare Moon knew there was another pony she could hold over the captain of the old guard, there wasn't a doubt in Armor's heart. that she would take her too. Perhaps this raid would be a nice break in pace, in some strange, twisted way. At least he never knew any griffins. The night sky was painted red as a bolt seared through the sky from the airship. The lieutenant paused as he watched it burn a trail. Red meant trouble. What could they have seen up there? The dragon let out a low growl, and he could feel it in his bones, and further down the street Armor found his answer. A lone griffin standing in the middle of the next intersection. The dragon's claws gouged trenches in the cobblestone street as it crouched low, and it began to advance. "Hold!" It stopped on his command, but Armor could still see its muscles tensed with anticipation beneath its natural armor. He did not like that this griffin was out in the open. Everything about it screamed ambush. "Huh. Impressive trick," the griffin called out with a sneer. "Tell me, have you taught it to sit and roll over yet?" The dragon snorted out plumes of black smog in response. Emerald flames barked out the sides of its mouth as it snapped wide its jaws. Armor saw the griffin twitch, but otherwise he held his composure well. "It knows much worse tricks than that," the lieutenant called back. As he covered the distance to the dragon, his eyes scanned along the rooftops for any other griffins. Garrison wouldn't have sent a flare if there was only one. "If you and your friends are compliant, though, you won't have to see any of them. Now, by order of Her Majesty, Princess Nightmare Moon, you are hereby under arrest for invading her sovereign kingdom and disrupting the peace of her subjects." The griffin laughed. "It'll be a cold moon in Tartarus when I bend to your princess's will," he declared. "We griffins are willing to make our final stand, no matter the odds. We have had enough of this eternal night. If you strike us down, only more will rise to take our place. More martyrs won't end this night any sooner. It'll only lead to more pony suffering. Believe me, I speak from experience." Shining Armor studied the griffin, hoping that by some miracle his words would break through to him. There was no luck to be had, though. The griffin had that same steely look that the lieutenant had seen dozens of times before in the eyes of other rebels, and he imagined he would still see it dozens more. "Just because you ponies lost your nerve to stand against your princess doesn't mean everyone else has," the griffin growled. "Then everyone else will just have to learn, as we have," Armor said with finality. "No pony stands against Her Majesty for long." His eyes flicked to the dragon, and the beast shuddered excitedly like a dog, licking its lips with its forked tongue. "He's all yours, dragon. Just make sure you keep him alive. Nightmare Moon might have some words for him." The beast released something that might have been a bark, although it was loud enough to cause the windows of the nearby buildings to shudder in their panes. Its body moved like a serpent, its hungry eyes pinned on the lone griffin, and the sight was enough to make him finally crack. His wings unfurled and pushed him back into the air. With a frantic look in his eyes, he brought a claw up to his beak and bit down on 2 talons, releasing a sharp whistle. Shining Armor tensed. There was the signal. All that was left now was the response. Off to his left and far overhead, he heard it, the low groan of metal buckling. He looked up and felt his gut drop. On the rooftop of a hotel at the intersection, a water tower began to tilt over the edge, multiple pairs of wings helping push it from behind. With a series of shrill pops, it came unhinged and toppled down to the streets below, falling perfectly to intercept the dragon. Everything seemed to move in slow motion before Shining Armor's eyes, and he let out a groan. crap. The dragon's spine pierced through the metal shell, and Armor managed to summon a protective shield around himself as the gutted tower spilled its contents, flooding the streets with water. The earth shook as the dragon collapsed in the road. The lieutenant eyed the heap of scales and muscle wearily, opting to keep his barrier up, even after the water drained away into the sewers below. Up above, the griffins jeered and celebrated. He wasn't sure what they thought they had accomplished. All they had succeeded in doing was making the beast angry. At first, he confused the dragon's growl for shifting rubble. With a force that caused the buildings nearby to shudder, it slammed its claw into the street, reared its head high, and released a pained, ear-splitting howl. A torrent of green flame spewed from its mouth, hot enough to cook the air. Armor's barrier became like an oven. Gasping, he had to release a spell before he was fried alive. As the flames died and the heat dissipated, the lieutenant struggled to blink the blinding afterimage out of his sight. By the time his eyes adjusted, he could already see 4 smoking griffins falling out of the sky. Like a flock of startled birds, nearly 24 griffins took flight from rooftops, but rather than fleeing, they started to swarm the dragon. The beast barked out a challenge, prying the husk of the water tower off its head, and started reaching for new victims. Armor could see the glint of metal in some of the griffins' claws. They were armed, though he couldn't quite tell with what. Though they didn't seem to do much damage against the dragon's stone-like scales, it was quickly apparent that they were agitating it, causing it to flinch with each strike as they flew by. The dragon got lucky. Reaching out with a claw, it managed to grab 5 griffins that drew too close. With a sadistic snarl, it popped open the top of the water tower in its other claw like it was a can, throwing its prey inside. Ignoring the other griffin's shouts and attempts to grab its attention, the dragon gave the tower a violent shake and crashed the open end into a nearby building. The remaining griffins reacted harshly to it, their attacks becoming more frequent. Armor found himself hesitating. If they kept attacking, they might eventually create a chink in its natural armor, or at the very least tire it out beyond use. It was too risky to fire off a bolt of magic and strike them, lest he miss and accidentally incur the dragon's wrath as well. I'm going to need backup for this, he muttered to himself. Reaching within, he closed his eyes and concentrated for a spell, one that would grab the attention of Garrison. If he hadn't already taken notice of the dragon's flare earlier. Purple light collected on the tip of his horn, and he launched it into the sky, where it erupted into a starburst. One of the griffins had taken notice, though, breaking off from the attack against the dragon. He landed heavily on the cobblestone before the lieutenant, and Armor recognized him as the same griffin from before. Brandishing a lead pipe, he snarled through his beak. You're gonna regret ever coming to this city. Armor took his stance, eyeing the griffin's weapon, and snarked. Funny, I'm pretty sure that was supposed to be my line. With an agitated shout, the griffin launched forward with its wings, faster than the unicorn had anticipated. He swung wildly with the pipe, starting with a high blow and following with a horizontal swipe. Shining Armor was caught backpedaling from the abrupt attack, sidestepping from the first strike and narrowly avoiding the second with a backstep. He was quick to recover, seeing an opening in the griffin's exposed side and charging forward. He drove his shoulder into the griffin as he readied for another attack, and the force caused the griffin to stagger back. With a gust from his wings, the griffin launched himself back. A little sturdy for a unicorn, the griffin coughed. Most of the time your kind freaks when your opponent gets up close and personal. Sorry to disappoint, Armor sneered. I have a little more experience than the guards you've tangled with before. It's going to take a little more than a rusty pipe to defeat me. As he spoke, a quintet of 5 purple lights sparked from his horn and hovered above him. He allowed himself to steal a glance past his opponent and toward the dragon. It seemed to have its claws full, but as he watched, it managed to spike another griffin out of the sky with its tail.
Whatever. You're all the same.
The griffin growled. He reared back and threw the pipe at the unicorn. Two of the floating lights darted forward in response, intercepting the pipe with twin bursts of magic. As it clattered against the cobblestone, Armor realized the griffin was no longer before him.
You all act so noble serving that witch!
Above him, diving down fast. Two more lights darted to intercept, but the griffin rolled to the side in the air just before the impact. Landing next to the lieutenant, the griffin made a swipe with his claw. This time, the unicorn wasn't fast enough. The talons raked across the armor on his cuirass, just below his exposed throat. The final light shot forward, and the griffin was too close to dodge. It collided into the side of his face and burst with a scent like burning hair. The griffin cried out and recoiled, taking back to the sky with powerful beats of his wings. His claws covered his right eye where the spell struck. Armor noticed a thin trail of smoke rising from the gaps in his talons.
Do you even know who you're fighting for?
The griffin demanded.
This eternal night is a curse!
You think we don't know that? Armor challenged. No pony in this kingdom likes it. Just the princess and her thestrals. The griffin pulled his claws away, revealing his newest scar, a black scorch mark where his otherwise gray feathers had burned away. The eye was swollen shut.
Yet here you are, fighting for her,
he growled.
You ponies are weak, buckling at the first sign of hardship, but we won't back down so easily. We'll fight to the last griffin.
He tucked his wings and dived down, talons outstretched for another strike. Shining Armor crouched low and tensed.
Easy words for stallions like us.
The unicorn jumped out of the way before the griffin could crash on top of him. Claws scraped through the air just before his eyes.
But not every pony can make that sacrifice.
He reached out with his magic, and two gusts of magically charged wind slammed into the griffin, knocking him back. And no pony should have to. What point is there in fighting to save a kingdom if there's no kingdom left to save in the end? The griffin gasped for breath as he recovered, lining himself up to charge again.
The point is to not give up.
He coughed.
To let the others believe they still have a fighting chance, even if they don't.
He pawed at the cobblestone and charged, leaping to the air once more with talons outstretched to grab the unicorn's neck. Armor focused on the griffin's claws, reaching out with his magic and forcing his will upon them. They jerked upward and froze in place, and the griffin squawked in surprise as his momentum ground to an abrupt halt. His hind legs swung like a lazy pendulum as he was suspended in the air by the wrists of his claws. Though the lieutenant stopped his attack, he could not prevent the daggers pouring out of the griffin's glare. In his eyes, Shining Armor saw a defiant fire burning, and he took a moment to study his opponent. Though the griffin was much larger than him, and of a different species entirely, the lieutenant saw a reflection of his younger self in him. Brash and hard-headed, with more pride than what was good for him, and prepared to make the sacrifice for the greater good.
I've been in your hooves before,
Shining Armor sighed.
And you're not too far from being in mine. You just haven't lost enough yet.
The griffin opened his beak to speak, but before a word could escape, his claws barreled down to the cobblestone street below, and the resulting slam knocked the wind out of him. Armor released his control, and the griffin curled up and groaned.
Let's just hope you don't have to make as many martyrs as me.
He glanced to the sidewalk and spotted a nearby street lamp. Closing his eyes, he concentrated, and the street lamp's frame shuddered against his will before falling limp like a rope. It slithered across the street, binding itself around the bested griffin and hardening back to its original rigidness. Shining Armor panted as the spell ended. Such magic was never his forte, but he learned what he could during his time with his family. His ears perked up. Far behind, the sound of shifting bricks filled the air, and his heart began to race. He turned around and found a sight far worse than he could have ever imagined. The dragon was scaling a building. It had taken an interest in a trio of griffins soaring above it, and with each foothold it made, its massive claws gouged into a floor, sending rubble down to the street below. The building shuddered, struggling desperately to hold a massive weight it was never meant to bear. If the building were to collapse, especially with the beast still on it. No. No! Shining Armor broke into a gallop. The dragon was 3 blocks away. He had to get it to stop. Get down from there, you idiot! Just let them go! Its hind foot dug a trench on the 5th floor, and it pushed up, fully taking its weight off the ground. Its front claw grappled the roof 6 floors higher. Stop it! Just... He slid to a halt, his words dying in his mouth as he could only stare and watch. The foundation gave way, and the structure began to tilt with a sound like an avalanche. The dragon glanced around in confusion, making a sound that was drowned by the thunderous churning of stone. A thick cloud of dust billowed out from beneath as the building collapsed into the street, growing as it consumed more of it. The last thing Armor saw was the edge of the building tumbling over the dragon's outstretched claw, before he was swallowed whole by the wall of dust. The sudden darkness was suffocating, literally so. Particles of cement reached down his throat with each breath like a claw, strangling his lungs. He tried to cough it out, tried to grab a fresh breath of air, but it was overwhelming. In his blindness, he could hear the last of the catastrophe, the shattering of glass and shrieks and pops of metal. After what felt like an eternity, the dust began to settle, ever so slightly. Shining Armor peeked open an eye, waving hoof at the remaining dust while trying to clear his lungs. Beneath the mountain of rubble at the other end of the street, he heard the dragon shift and groan. If he could breathe, he would have sighed in relief. Well, at least the dragon was still in one piece. For better or worse. Although it did manage to create a lot of property damage. The building it had climbed was reduced completely to rubble, and its fall seemed to have punctured a hole in the street with its hind leg, exposing the sewer system beneath. He coughed again, and as he glanced back at the hole, a figure climbed out. A unicorn.
What was that?
She coughed. Armor felt an icicle pierce his heart. The haze settled more, and the silhouette had color. A painfully familiar shade of purple. No. It couldn't have been. Another figure flew out of the hole with a pair of wings. A griffin.
Come on, Twilight! We can't stay here! We need to keep moving!
What?
Another coughing fit cut Shining Armor off as he tried to speak. His mind was moving faster than he could keep up with. Even without the dust constricting his lungs, he wasn't sure if he could form the words. That gut-wrenchingly familiar voice spoke again.
What was that?
It's probably another guard,
the griffin said.
It's not safe here! Come on!
He tried to call again.
No, wait, come back.
But it was too late. The unicorn and the griffin vanished into the haze, like haunting ghosts. He only wished it could be so. The dark thoughts squirmed rampantly within his mind, consuming everything it touched until he couldn't ignore it anymore. Dreadful tears streaked from his eyes as he broke into a gallop after the pair. Fear had his heart in a vice. It couldn't have been her. It shouldn't have been her. Why did it have to be her?